Christchurch, yes, I think it will take 20 years for Christchurch to really become an urban space again, for the city to sort of mesh as an urban environment. Cities do take a long time to happen. I think there's no reason why that can't happen in Christchurch. It will take a lot of energy, a lot of commitment by everybody involved in the built environment, and a lot of patience on the part of the citizens here, I think, and people that live and work in Christchurch. The main danger that could, in terms of the vibrancy of the future city of Christchurch, would be the amount of development on the outskirts of the city, or even further away from the city into the countryside, which does draw the population out of the city and give it perhaps less reason to inhabit the city fully, and that can impact, as I think I mentioned in my talk, on the way that the city ends up being more of a sterile environment. You don't get the breadth of grain of different people living and working and interacting. Yeah, cities really need to be completely mixed-use environments. They weren't always. I remember when 30, 40 years ago, the cities had very little people actually living in them. It's only really in the last 20 years that apartments have become popular and have reinvigorated many of our cities. And, there's no reason why that shouldn't happen over a 20-year period in Christchurch as well. Yes?
I'm fascinated by that click graph system, and I'm imagining going to City Council for building consent for it.
Yes.
Has it been brands tested, or any of that stuff?
It has not been approved as a alternative solution for the building code yet, no. I believe Chris is working on that. It's not necessarily an aspect of its structure that's not compliant. It's more its weatherproofness, what cladding materials are used, and so forth. And all of the prototypes that he's built so far, he has used very lightweight cladding materials and transparent cladding materials that clearly wouldn't stack it up to a proper weatherproof environment. But I believe he is working down those lines. I'm not sure how far he's getting. It could take a very long time to achieve his goal of making it one of the standard ways of building structures. He's actually involved in the design of the Redcliffe's kindergarten building, where aspects of that building will use the click graph system, but I'm not sure if the external envelope will use it. Yes?
From an architect's perspective, what are the biggest barriers, regulatory barriers, to solving some of these problems you've outlined? And also, if an architect knows there's private capital out there, people that look at this as a huge problem and want to solve it, people billions of dollars, what do you think is the most efficient allocation of their resources when they're trying to solve this problem?
Those are very big and difficult questions. In terms of the biggest obstacles, just in relation to the last question, I mean, building compliance can be quite difficult to achieve different alternative solutions and to prove that those alternative solutions work. And often it can take a lot of time and money and get people like brands, the Building Research Association of New Zealand, involved to sort of test systems that you might want to use. The other way would be to avoid being too innovative, really. Although I think the click graph system is a wonderful opportunity, people like Michael Maltzan in LA are just using very standard building technologies and building methods. It's just all timber framing. I'm not sure if they have quite the same weatherproofness codes that we have, but it's all timber framing with sort of lathe and stucco at the outside, so it's actually very, very cheap external fabric for building. In terms of what would be the highest priorities, if there were foundations out there that wanted to fund, it would really depend on the communities and community groups to identify where that money would best be spent. Obviously, there's a big need for those who are completely without homes, and that's the more urgent need. But there's another need, I think, for helping people, not necessarily financially, but maybe through example or through education of some kind of how there could be different ways to achieve housing solutions for themselves. That it's not necessarily the single private home that we should all be aspiring to necessarily. Perhaps there are other ways of living, other ways of pooling your resources to achieve different results. But often, well, not often, yes, sometimes those kinds of different sort of social approaches have difficulty from a financial point of view in terms of they don't fit the criteria for what the banks will lend to. So that's another big obstacle really with that first question. Any other questions? Yes.
That project they had at the beginning there, where they started with a $7,000 framework, and the people
Yes.
were allowed to complete it themselves.
Yes.
What percentage of them actually completed a reasonable building, and how did you provide the motivation for them to do that?
The motivation, I think, was provided by the fact that they were owning these things and that they would personally benefit from the improvements, not just the benefit of the improved living environment, but financially benefit from the improved value of the unit. So I believe, although not everyone's done it in the same way, I believe the very high majority of those residents have all been involved in upgrading their buildings. I mean, you have to remember that what they were living in before, which was more of a sort of shantytown type settlement, they built all those buildings themselves anyway. But this is sort of providing a framework and a more regulatory framework for them to use those skills that they do have to improve their own living conditions in a more positive way.
My understanding was that they were sort of living in a shantytown because they didn't have the motivation in the first place.
I don't think it was necessarily a motivation. There were no alternatives offered to them in the first place. That was kind of the only way that they could find to establish shelter for themselves and to establish a community. They weren't just establishing a house for themselves, they actually were establishing a community, which was why the government decided to keep them in that location rather than shift them to the outskirts of town, because they recognised that that community was important to those people, but also to the fabric of the city.
And they shared skills and things like that or something like
I don't know in detail, but one would presume that, yes. Yes?
And what do you think the local bodies could do to encourage inner city housing? As you were saying before, which we know is subdivisions on the edge and way out, and that's making people out there instead of into the middle of the city.
Well, Christchurch is encouraging some inner city housing. It is part of the blueprint. It's part, you've got the Eastern Frame. You do have individual developers doing housing developments through areas sort of north of Samar Street and so forth, in that area, which has traditionally been a lot of inner city housing anyway, high density inner city housing. So they're keeping that model in those areas. So it's not so much that the city council isn't encouraging it. It's just Christchurch is in a slightly different situation because everyone did vacate the city because of the earthquakes to find other places to live out of necessity almost. And others are leaving for sort of psychological reasons or whatever. The trick is to encourage people to come back in, and I think a lot of the developments that are happening will do that. But I think it's important to remember that they will need to still have quality architectural aspects to them to make them attractive to future residents, and also so that they become a well-integrated part of the city and fit in well with a lot of the neighbouring developments. As I said before, I think the city should be mixed-use developments. All of our other major cities have a lot of housing in them now. Wellington's got a huge amount of apartments for the size of the city, so has Auckland, but not just apartments, the sort of student housing, all those kinds of things that are happening in the city, that enliven the city. In some ways, because the university is way out here, the opportunity for student housing in the city to enliven the city is maybe a harder one to achieve in Christchurch, but it's one that happens in almost all of our other cities. Yes.
You mentioned that you went to the workshop with a collaboration with other people regarding What are the major developments that have emerged from that you could perhaps share
That
with us?
was almost an introductory session. I think it was just the second session that they had on that. So it was a brainstorming workshop where a whole lot of ideas were put together from the various different interest groups that were there, and that's been collated and that's been distributed out to everybody that attended that workshop. And I think there is the intention to have further workshops to try and put together some kind of strategy, I suppose, some kind of collaborative strategy that will assist future housing developers in the city.
But nothing set in concrete at this stage?
No, nothing set in concrete at all, and I'm not sure if things will be set in concrete as such. They'll just be strategies and sort of ways of doing things and ideas and a sort of structure to help support the delivery of housing and different kinds of housing, better quality housing than maybe some of the developers have been doing today. Excuse me. Yes, I'll be back.
Do you think that excellent architecture can influence people that are building single-storey houses on the outskirts of Christchurch to live centrally in a higher density, almost inevitably higher density to be able to live in the centre of Christchurch?
Not on its own. They're not the excellence of architecture on its own. There'd be other factors that would need to come in as well. But if people aspire to living in more pastoral conditions with larger sections and gardens and so forth, then no matter how good the architecture is, they're not going to be tempted to come into a central city high-rise apartment, are they? I think the question would be not to try to take people completely away from those living environments that they have decided they want to be part of, because in themselves they're creating communities too, just as people in Chile were creating their own community. It would be possibly to provide different architectural models of how those housing subdivisions are developed, because at the moment the rules sort of support single houses certain distances away from their boundaries and away from their front boundaries and so forth. There's all these rules and regulation about measurement and where you should put the house in the yard, which kind of isolate and separate people and end up with all those sort of separate individual units like I showed on the screen before. So really those sorts of town planning rules and regulations need to be relooked at and relaxed and interrogated as to whether they really are the types of rules that benefit good living and that encourage a kind of gelling of communities rather than just providing individual accommodation. At the front first, yes.
I wonder if you could comment further on Brown Village. I
Yes.
thought it came down primarily because of damage, structural damage.
I haven't seen the structural reports on Broad Village, so I can't entirely comment, although it has been said in the media that a lot of the damage was to the courtyard areas and external areas, a lot of the concrete paved sort of slabs, green buildings, and that very little of the actual buildings themselves seem to be out of level. But I would just question whether I guess the economics of it, of repairing and re-strengthening and refurbishing those buildings were really that thoroughly assessed in terms of not just the cost of doing it now, but the cost of the long-term cost of maintaining those buildings in that position. More about sort of what I said before of the long-term costs over the lifetime of the buildings. There could still be a lot of life left in that building, even though you need to bring it up to current standards. And there's a lot of embodied energy in every single building that has been built, every one you pull down, you lose that and you spend it again building a new one. So all those kinds of economic factors really need to be determinated too. But from an architectural point of view, whether it would be safe or not, I don't know, but from an architectural point of view, I still consider that a loss to the city. Because it has certain kind of cultural value for its time in that location and supported a particular type of resident in Christchurch.
Hi. Something near and dear to Kiwis' hearts is mum. Always has been. I scoped a lot of damaged high-rise and residential dwellings in the city and estimated them. Originally, architects' fees and the other consultants were normally between 14.5% to 16.5% on high-rise government buildings. With the arrival of the developers, they would drop to 7 to 9%. And the New Zealand Institute of Architects, shall we say, dropped their on-site surveillance, for the want of a better word, of construction. Now, by getting rid of the Clerk Works Act in the early 1990s, I seen firsthand the deterioration in the construction. Now, one of the problems we have with the rebuild is lack of supervision on sites. And how do you feel if, say, for instance, the New Zealand Institute of Architects would address that problem?
I think if it is as you described, the Institute of Architects should address that problem directly. Of all of the architects that I know and relate with, we would all relish the opportunity to supervise the projects that we design. Very often it is either the client's decision to, again for money-saving reasons, to dispense with the architect's fees once the documentation has been completed, and for the architect to be involved merely on an as-required basis on an hourly rate. And that has become a norm in the industry, and that is a problem, I do agree. Project managers, to a certain extent, in the commercial industry were supposedly taking over some of those roles, but of course none of them had the background or building experience to really supervise the building. They might be able to supervise the contract in some way, but they weren't able to supervise the building. So I would agree that it's an issue that we do need to address, yes. Yes?
There seems to be a mantra that the further out from the centre of some enclave, Ranking or Woodend, what have you, that you go, the larger the plot sizes and the larger the houses. How can architecture help us to put smaller, more ecologically friendly houses on the outskirts of some of our existing conurbations without all of the planners going in the picture?
I think the architects would need to influence the planners in some way to change those planning rules as much as the planning rules I mentioned before in terms of siting a house on its own property, the rules around subdivision sizing, as you say, the larger units and so forth are not sensible. If we could, I think the idea was that the more you spread stuff out, the least noticeable it is in the countryside. Actually, the more you concentrated those elements and actually made centres of those developments and left the majority of that countryside untouched, it would be a far more successful outcome for the environment. So it's an issue that not just architects, but architects and engineers and civil engineers could bring up with the town planners to see if there is some likely change there. But any of this sort of suggested change within the building industry environment would be well supported if people generally brought these issues up as well. People who wanted to live on a small block with a little cabin or whatever out past West Milton. If those people started talking to the city councils and planners as well as the professions, I'm getting tired. It probably sounded in my voice. I think I've spoken enough, and I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you all for coming and for your attendance, and have a good evening.